Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Talking Landscape Photography, and we're really excited to be back for another show. It's been interesting now going on to our fortnightly schedule and not being able to be with you every week, but we very much appreciate you tuning in and joining us. So tonight we've got the illustrious Paul Hoelen with us, and also Carolyn Cheng, who we really can't wait to dive into all of her background and the beautiful work that she does, and sort of maybe hear some stories about what Paul's like on the road, given all of the amount of time that she spent with him shooting. So yeah, welcome everyone. And Paul, have you been out shooting much lately?
Well, we were just saying before that Lukey's background is literally, I live just right behind where his head's positioned, actually. And
he doesn't actually live in the brewery itself, but yeah.
Yeah, not in the brewery itself, but literally about 2 minutes up the road from there. And the coloration of the leaves is exactly like that. We're in the peak of autumn, which is easily the best time of the year in Tasmania. We're getting lots of incredible days, and I managed to get the spicy flu right in the middle of the peak of autumn season in the Fagus. And from what I could see, especially at Cradle, was one of the best we've had for a long time. So I was just a bit like, oh God, missed the boat. I'm a little bit rusty because I was up really late putting in a submission for APA Stories, actually, for the Mammoth Heart Project. And I undenied about doing that for a few years now, and I finally got permission from the Tasman board to do it. And I thought, don't be lazy, have a crack. So it'd be interesting to see, because I feel like the work was more current and relevant when it first got released 4 years ago. So it's not quite as maybe crisp and sharp and edgy as maybe my newer work, but as a body of work, it's still really powerful. So I popped that in there. And Luke and I are preparing for a big 4-day workshop starting in a day or so on Bruni, which is going to be pretty exciting and pretty dynamic.
Absolutely.
You want to speak a bit about that, Luke? You've done a bit more prep time for this one.
Yeah, well, the weather's looking pretty nice, which is good. There's one day where it's a bit rainy and a bit cloudy, but yeah, all things considered, given it's a bit of a, I was going to say Russian roulette, it's not the most appropriate term now, but it can be anything can happen. So it's always nice if you get some nice days. So yeah, it should be really good. Yeah, no, I also haven't been able to get out and shoot much. I've actually been moving house, so I've got a new studio that's been set up, and yeah, that's taken up most of my time, as well as also getting the spicy flu after a job that I had that unfortunately, when you're working across close proximity with a whole bunch of people over 5 days and someone has it, you can't really do much about it. So that's the nature of the beast at the moment. And Carolyn, how about yourself? Have you been out to do some shoots lately?
I haven't been able to do any aerial photography, but lots of sort of local botanical and still life in the studio. My Greenland trip just got moved forward another year for the, I think, second or third year in a row.
Wow.
But I am making plan B. So I think I will get up in the air somewhere in Canada for sure this summer, maybe in Europe too. So I'm making plans.
Whereabouts in Canada would you?
Okay, I might jump in and just introduce Caroline.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I just no, it's fine. It's I've been looking forward to this for a very long time, like probably, I reckon it's on and off for about a year. I've been trying to work out a spot to get Caroline on the show, and quite conscious of, I've known Caroline for quite a long time, and we've done some incredible journeys around Australia together, multiple trips actually of, even 8-10 days in length, and together we've shot some of the most beautiful area work we've done collectively, and it's there's not many people in the world I can actually say that about that I've done. So it's going to be interesting to see what Caroline reflects back. It's like a traveling with me, and maybe the little bit of nudge or influence we might have given each other at the time. But I'd say sort of on a global sort of level, when I look at who the people are that inspire me with their level of refinement and discernment and acceleration of growth and the quality and caliber of how their work presents and how cohesively they pull their work together and how the clarity of their purpose and focus and intention behind their work, that Carolyn really stands out globally for me. And I genuinely mean that. And it's been a real privilege to watch her kind of flourish out on the world stage and bits and pieces. And I was quite conscious also that momentum was probably curbed quite a lot last few years with COVID in particular. And I'm quite interested tonight to delve into that journey and also where it's taken her. And at the end of the show, we're going to be looking at some of her new body of work that's been born kind of, I guess, not necessarily out of necessity, but partly designed, partly necessity due to COVID and not being able to follow through on some of her earlier sort of motivations. So yeah, there's a number of talks out there online, and I might check in with Carolyn what they are if people can look at later at the end of the show. That and a few of them really stood out for me. I was like, oh my goodness, that was just exceptional. And there's not many people I know in the world that could present themselves with that level of clarity and depth and intentionality. And so yeah, I've been waiting a long time and very, very happy to have Caroline on the show. So welcome, madam. From
Thank you, Paul.
Ontario, Canada.
I was like, I don't know if I could live up to this introduction, but thank you for those wonderful words. It's interesting to hear you talk about my journey because obviously you've been a huge part of that. And I think I sought you out when I saw some of your aerial work, and I was really fascinated by it, and really wanted to spend more time in Australia. And it seemed that sort of our vision and how we approach things and the things that we were interested in, there was a commonality that made sense to reach out to you. And as part of the conversation a little bit later, one of the big gifts that I say that you gave to me was really giving me the opportunity to become far more independent as an aerial photographer. And so that was a wonderful gift that you gave me. And it's been great to have those journeys together. I don't have any terrible stories to bring up, but we could chat.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, that's just like... to be objective. Well, I mean, it was interesting. Like Carolyn reached out to me. What would have been like 5 years ago, maybe?
Our last. Oh yeah. Okay.
But
So
the
with
first time.
2018, maybe our first trip.
Okay, yeah, I think so. And I think he'd done some trips with Tony Hewitt before, or a few sort of high-end people. And Carolyn also struck me as quite a confident person in that she wasn't afraid to reach out to the best of the best and say, here I am, how about it?
Did she reach out to you? No, that's right.
Yeah. I don't know where you're going with that, Lucky, but and yeah, so she's like, would you help guide me on some locations and help get to some incredible places? And I learned a lot from Caroline because she's incredibly thorough in terms of her research and deeply considered about where she wants to go, what she wants to create, and to a level that not many people are actually, in my experience. And it's sort of challenged me to really look under the hood and get down to the nth degree of the choices we made. And during that sort of first one, which was a little bit more kind of leaning on probably my experience, I thought, well, here's an opportunity to support somebody to empower themselves to get to be able to do this by themselves and not need some crusty old dude like me to help out with things. And so I kind of challenged Caroline quite a bit to, actually, I'm going to put you in charge of the plane, or you're the one who's going to talk to the pilot, or you got the front seat, or I'm going to get you to sort of put the design into this plan. And it wasn't sort of easy to put somebody on the ropes to do that. But I think we'll talk more about that later. It was beautiful to see Caroline respond to that and just flourish, I guess, and take things to the next level herself by just grabbing it by the reins. And it was a real privilege and one that I've really had the opportunity to do, to be honest, in my career. So
it's probably worth mentioning that, that's something you're open to, isn't it, Paul, if anyone else wants to have that kind of experience with you as well?
Oh, I love it. Like to have a one-on-one, like we had was it 8 or 10 days, I think, like one-on-ones around the whole of Australia, like twice. It was just, it was a bit of a dream for me. Like that's, getting that level of autonomy and independence about where we go and what we do, and having that, Carolyn was already quite aware from my work that the style and the kind of aesthetic of what she was looking for, and even the subject matter, was quite in line with myself. And so it actually made it really empowering for both of us to choose places and go places and shoot and fly in a way that we were both coming out sort of buzzing with what we got. And that's not always the case, with other photographers. People have different nuances or aesthetics or styles or ways of working or different sort of personalities and energy, and we tended to work really beautifully together, I thought. And for
Yeah,
having to deal with.
You were saying that, and I didn't realize how lucky I was in that sense. So, because it's true, even when you're thinking about being in the airplane with other photographers, if they don't use the same lenses, have a similar, point of view, it's actually quite hard to manage. So yeah, we were really lucky.
Yeah, and a simple thing like that, like somebody likes shooting wide, somebody likes shooting intimate and close, that you've got an issue because you actually need to fly the plane at completely different heights to get what you want. And it's kind of like, oh, how's this going to work? And all of a sudden the efficiency and the productivity of what's a pretty sort of high investment approach to photography, financially and otherwise, it's like, wait a minute, how's that going to work? And I actually did Caroline probably for the first time. I just came back from a 4,000-kilometer, 20-hour journey with 3 photographers at once, which I've never done.
I saw that. I can't say that I wasn't jealous,
yeah,
but I was happy for you guys.
Year and a half in the making, lots of false starts due to weather and COVID and challenges as well. Like shooting with 3, you can't shoot out the same side of the plane. It was literally like leaning over and you're staring at sky while the other guys are shooting the magic and having to take turns and that kind of thing. But the camaraderie and the even the economics of sharing as well sort of worked out quite well in the end. And you just have to pull back a little bit and recognize that you don't necessarily have the final say in how long and what we do. You've got to sort of pull back a little bit because you're sharing more. Sharing is caring. So there's a little bit less attachment to the specificity of what you're shooting to some extent. At the same time as
how did it work?
We went ahead, and if we knew there were specific areas we really wanted to nail, we would negotiate to get the best spot in the plane before we took off. But we landed quite a bit in small areas and really remote places so we could swap seats as well. And
okay,
but sometimes we just had to take a hit, or I took a leaf out of Lukey's book and got one of those what do you call them, Lukey? The window.
Oh, the lens skirt.
Lens skirts, yeah. So at least I could have a crack at something out the other side. And luckily the pilot was open.
What's a lens skirt?
It's like this attachable black Velcro hood, which actually you can seal around the barrel of your lens, and it just takes away all the reflections of the window if you only have an option to glass. And this plane had basically brand new glass. So like there it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're a big sort of hood that and they've got the suction cups on the end here that can.
So I got invited, but I couldn't go. But Luke just did a flight to Antarctica on a Dreamliner for 9 hours shooting auroras, and that's just the kind of opportunity that the only way you're.
Oh my gosh, that is my dream.
It was
my dream flight.
Pretty amazing. You don't really get to see aurora australis like that. So you get to finally see it like you would see it in Iceland or Norway. So.
And you got to fly over like all the ice too. That's really what I want to do. And I know it's
Antarctica itself.
Oh,
the
okay.
Aurora Oval is not quite. Yeah, in fact,
pretty
over
close.
You wouldn't really see as much aurora as where we were, right in the thick of it there. So, but yeah, that was pretty.
And of course, you're at night. You're not going to see the auroras, so it was. That was deliberately timed to be in the peak sort of dark hour, and yeah, very difficult thing technically to shoot, but geez, what an experience.
Challenging.
I was sort of like, I was invited too, which was a real privilege. And then I realized I had a 12-day like deep immersive rainforest ecology documentary to film like right in the middle, and I was trying to negotiate being able to run out the middle and go to the trip and come back, and they were like, yeah, no, that's going to work. And I was like, so I missed it. But anyway, I'm kind of rambling on a bit too long, but at the same time, it's nice to paint a wider picture, and I have been looking forward to kind of sharing that story with Caroline for a long, long time. And it's a very special and unusual kind of experience in my career to spend that much time with someone and watch them, respond and develop just so incredibly beautifully, and just rocket shipping after that as well. So real testament to Caroline's confidence and drive. She's a very driven person and a very, very capable and extremely intelligent person as well. And yeah, the kind of aesthetic of and I guess a refinement and the genuineness of an artistic approach, I think, is I don't find that common either. And I would absolutely say that Caroline sort of carries that in spades, and it weaves through her work really beautifully. And I'll let her sort of take the reins and give us a little bit of background on her, and we'll talk about some of her influences and kind of a journey and that evolution through the real stage and out into, you know, the newer sort of body of work that I'm particularly interested to talk to Caroline about, because I've only seen it and I haven't spoken to you about it at all. So you're in for a treat, everyone. I'm going to pipe down a little bit and kind of let Caroline take the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much, Luke. Nice to meet you virtually for the first time. And thanks to everyone for joining in today. Really appreciate it. So my name is Carolyn Cheng. I guess I would describe as an abstract and aerial photographer who likes to focus, at least in the field, on kind of the smaller scenes and the intimate landscapes. But when I'm in the air, it's the abstract aerial landscapes, much like Paul. And during the pandemic, I haven't been traveling as much, so I started to focus on taking more botanical vignettes in black and white, sometimes inversions and sometimes solarizations, all as ways to abstract and depart from reality, which is the kind of thing that I really like to do. I do work full-time as well as the Chief Operating Officer of Royal LePage, which is a national real estate franchisor here in Canada. So I do photography in all of my spare time. It's pretty much the thing that occupies most of it, other than being with family and friends, of course. Okay, so well, I thought for today's session, I would talk about perhaps evolving your photographic voice. So as Paul alluded to, you know, the pandemic has really been a huge external shock to all of our lives. So many of us have evolved our photography practices during this time, although travel is clearly opening back up now. But I thought I'd share how I first developed my photographic voice and then how it's shifted during the pandemic and what I see going forward. So let me just share my screen with you. Okie doke. Do you see that?
All looking good.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. So like most landscape photographers, my love of the outdoors started at a young age. My parents took us on lots of outdoor hikes in local parks, as pictured here with my mom. Unfortunately, I don't have a digital image of my father and brother, nor of us in hiking gear, but at least you can see us in the Gatineau parks here, which was, you know, a 20-minute drive from our house when I was growing up. And we were also fortunate to travel annually with my father when he went on work conferences with the university. And as luck would have it, it would often be to wonderful natural places like Banff National Park here in Canada. And as a young adult, I continued that love of hiking, especially in the high mountains. So here you'll see me with my brother on a trip trekking to Mount Everest Base Camp that we were able to take together just before he got married and started a family. So it was really nice that we had that time together just before all of that happened. And as you'll see from the quality of these snapshot images, I was very much a travel photographer and not a landscape photographer yet. We can come back to this at any point in time, Paul, if you want me to tell stories. But
well, what sort of height did you get to out there?
Great question. So the village, or that's probably strong, the town, the few sort of cabins that are very close to Everest Base Camp and where you would start the ascent if you were doing something like that is at, I think, 5,148 meters.
Oh, wow. That's pretty high.
And then from there, so I believe that the area is called Gorak. So from there, if you want, they take you up to Kalapatar. So that's at 5,500 meters. So you can go that high and then you kind of get a closer vantage point and you can see all the different like camps if you were to properly do an Everest ascent. Everest Base Camp was plenty fine for me. In fact, like I handled the altitude like fairly well. My brother always has like slightly more challenges, so we spend a little bit more time acclimatizing. But the one time I would say Most mornings we could, kind of get going 8:30 or 9. So the sun was out, it was warm. But the morning we ascended Kalapatar, we had to be up at 5:30. So it was probably -10, -20. So it was cold. And then there was less and less oxygen. So it was the one time where I really actually felt like my chest was constricting. And I thought, okay, if this continues much longer, you're going to have to turn back, Carolyn. But thank goodness, like I saw the prayer flags at the top and we got there. So yeah, that's as high as we went, 5,500 meters. We did the classic ascent up to base camp, and then we crossed over the Chola Pass, which is definitely a little more technical, not gear technical, but you're doing a lot more, climbing on rocks and not on trail as much. And then we came down the Gokyo side, which I think many would say is the more,
there, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah, it's the more beautiful side maybe, because there's glacial lakes, and from that vantage point, Everest, which is the 2 vantage points you'll see here, Everest actually does look like the largest mountain, whereas on the classic side, Everest doesn't look like the largest mountain.
Wow. I've had that experience too, actually. I did the Annapurna circuit in 2020 or 2019, and similar early start, and the altitude really gets you when you get into those sort of heights. It's amazing.
Definitely. But Paul, I know you wanted some funny stories, so I did have one plan. The rest will have to be organic.
Yeah, when it works.
So my brother, we'd had to spend a few more days at this one place because he needed a little time to acclimatize. And then we thought we were ready to go. We'd spent a few days there. And then I got a bacterial infection, like from the water or something like that. And we got super lucky because there was a doctor there. And I always bring antibiotics with me. And so, but he told me what I could do, and that was great. So got better pretty quickly, and then we were able to move on. And I remember thinking, oh, Carolyn, you've got to be so, so careful. And then the next day, just before we were, going to do the ascent up to Kalapatar, I had a mouth guard because I grind my teeth at night. And I was being so careful with it and cleaning it. And I dropped it into yak dung. So that was not fun. So we were like, oh no, what do we do? And it was dried. It's just that yak dung is the fuel for everything there. So the plan was get it boiled in water at the kitchen, and harkening back to today, dunk it in the hand sanitizer because it said 99% alcohol, and then put it back in the water. And I didn't get sick. So thankfully that all worked out.
Yeah, good move.
But yeah, so yeah, I think a lot of us really have a love of nature, the outdoors, and that was for sure very similar for me. Now back.
Sorry? Just before we move on, is that somewhere that you feel like you want to go back to, or you've had your experience and you're happy? Like, did it have a sense of closure about it, or was it more like opening a door to maybe more in your life?
Well, I would say that I'll get to this in the next part, but I just developed some, I guess, injuries from wear and tear. And so there are some things that I can't do anymore. So I would have said, I would have for sure continued and want to continue. But there's just some things that I can't do anymore. So I'm a little sad about that, but I'm glad that I had the opportunity before.
Yeah, I haven't made it that high, and I'm like, my window's shrinking. It's getting older, so I'm feeling it.
You should do it, Paul. You'd love it.
I know, I'd love it. I managed to get sort of high in Bhutan, but not as high as that.
Okay, so back in those days, in my spare time, much of it was dedicated to cycling and racing. And you'll see me here with the team on the left. And in those days, when I went to the US Southwest, it was spent at training camp and not doing photography. So that was Arizona, which we would all see differently through the lens of landscape photography. I used to train about 6 to 10 hours a week back in those days, whether it was, weights, base building for easy rides, shorter interval training, and or longer 2 to 3 hour weekend rides. Then suddenly life threw me a bit of a curveball. So one day I just couldn't sit on a bicycle comfortably anymore. I thought the discomfort would go away after a quick visit to the physio, as it had always done. But 7 years later, while I'm much better than I was, I still can't do all of the intense physical exercise that I used to be able to do. So while the racing door closed, the photography one opened. And when I thought of what I loved to do, it was travel and photography. So I thought, well, why not do photography at a far more artistic level than I had done before? And I don't recall where I'd seen the images now, but the aerial photography of Antony or Tony Spencer, the intimate landscapes of Sarah Marino, and as Marcel van Oosten would say, his images infused with the minimalism and sharp impact of a graphical design background all really resonated with me. The learning curve was really steep at the beginning, but I eventually did take to it. On my very first group photography workshop in 2015, so now some 7 years ago, I felt rather overwhelmed initially. I had thought that my photography was decent, and perhaps for travel photography, it was okay, but the group on the trip was really experienced. It was, of course, led by professionals, but there were some very serious amateurs in the group, some of whom are professionals today, many repeat clients that had a lot of experience, and there were only a handful of inexperienced photographers like me. Thankfully, the instruction was great, and the daily critique, while a bit difficult on the ego initially for vacation time, was more helpful than I realized at the moment. When I had come home, I realized that this was the best set of photographs I had ever taken thus far. So here you'll see, while I learned to take many of the classic landscapes that we all know about Namibia, I was also able to find a composition that felt more unique to me as well. And to this day, this is probably my favorite photo that I took back in Namibia in 2015. You'll notice that early on, I was already honing in on the more intimate landscape. And when I look back even, at all of my travel photography, I had always enjoyed those smaller scenes a little bit more. One of my next trips was to China. I was really drawn to the shapes and patterns that could be rendered from photographing the fishing villages in Shapu. So here you can see crab nets. I love how they look like they're floating in the water or maybe even suspended in clouds if you kind of run with your imagination, and that your mind doesn't really know what they are. As you can see, it's not just the intimate landscape, but patterns that I also really enjoy. And in a continuation of patterns, here's one of the exposed wood grain from paint that easily wears away in harsh conditions in Greenland. So when photographing icebergs in summer in Greenland, the optimal light for those is in the evening. So in the daytime, and you have a lot because it's almost 24-hour sun, we'd find boat junkyards or woodsheds to photograph. And this was the very first one that I came upon that I was just really taken with the patterns. Now, as my skills improved, I could make good compositions in more complex landscapes. So here in the Eastern Sierras, it's a much busier scene, but the layers of color help to move your eye through the scene. This was actually my third trip to the Eastern Sierras. The first two were solo, but the latter one, I went with David Thompson, who many of you may know and has been a big mentor to me. So his tips on composition and field were really, really helpful to creating images like this.
Carolyn, can you tell us a little bit more about David? I'm really just checked him online quite a bit, and I've offered to get him on the show, but he haven't quite got there yet. But I've been fascinated by kind of who he is and the kind of influence he's been sort of building and having, largely just who he is, as well as his incredible abilities. And I'm just curious a bit more about who he is, and you're a good person to probably speak to that.
Okay, you broke up a little bit. Your question was, who is he? How did we get connected? How we work together, kind of thing?
Yeah, well, a bit more about who David is. I'm quite fascinated to meet him and get him on the show. He said he, but I haven't been able to nail him down to anything. But I'm very, very curious about who he is, and from our conversations, it's clear he's had quite a big influence on your work and your career even. And yet who he is a bit of a mystery to me personally. So I just thought lead into how that's influenced your work.
Yeah, so, David and I met, I'm trying to think how, so we met through a photographer, one of the photographers that I had gone to Namibia with, Justin Resnick, and he knew David, and I was going to be out in Death Valley. So he had recommended, reaching out to David if I wanted, to go with somebody. So that's how we first connected. And I was pretty lucky just because we kind of hit it off right away. David has a pretty easygoing nature, and he's a pretty direct person too. So it was very easy to, start chatting, but also I think it was very easy to, ask him questions and get feedback. And I think David is somebody that, really responds to people that really want to learn, right? Like I think where David and I are very similar is that he has a real sense of continuous improvement. So even though, he's at the top of his game, he's always like looking to learn more things. And whether it's within the landscape photography genre or, different artistic realms where he can learn different things about processing or composition, he's really open-minded and always looking to improve. So I think as a mentor and as a photographer, that's been a really delightful thing to have, because somebody that's always looking to improve and always looking to do better, it's a great person to learn from. I would say that David really prides himself on diversity. He likes to be able to shoot in a whole bunch of different kinds of locations, different kinds of landscapes. And one of the things that I would say I think is different than some of the other photographers that I've photographed with David is he is extremely agile. So he does not like to sit in one spot for very long. I mean, of course, there is scouting and sometimes there is waiting for light. But I think why he is one of the most dynamic and productive photographers that I've ever met is that he doesn't like to sit in one spot for too long. And I think in the desert, when the light is quite fleeting, and that's a lot of where David does spend a lot of time, I think you do have to be quite agile. So I think that's something I think that really stands out to me in terms of one of his differences. And I think that's also why he likes the diversity. He likes to be really adaptable and really move with the light. And then I think in terms of processing, I think he really, he looks at everything with a very, he's very thorough, I would say. So he teaches the basics really well, but he also moves into, intermediate and advanced topics. And, he really is discerning about how he approaches everything and how he critiques everything and how he looks at everything. He really gives it a lot of consideration, and he lets things sit for a long time before he releases them. So that's a little bit about David.
You've lent on him quite a bit for the curation of your work too, haven't you, Carolyn?
Yeah, so I would say with David at the beginning, it was just learning a lot of the basics around processing. And then it was, as we got more and more advanced, more advanced techniques. And then we would also work on the order in which you would present the work. So yeah, definitely. That give you some insights into David?
Yeah, no, that was really helpful actually. Thanks for that segue. But yeah, so David Thompson, he's a Las Vegas-based photographer in America, and hoping to get him on the show at some stage. David.
Okay, so as my skills improved, I could make good compositions in complex landscapes. Oh, excuse me, we already covered that. Okay, so, and, as we were talking about David, the cypress swamps were also an environment that had a real busyness to them, and compositions were also quite difficult. And so it was here that I really learned about this notion of asymmetrical symmetry, all from a kayak, so a somewhat moving object that you would slow down before you would take a photograph, all the while avoiding crocodiles and water snakes. So I mentioned this simply in terms of the asymmetrical symmetry, because while landscape photography on the ground is very different than in the air, this particular composition style really helped me in the air when the landscape is really, really complicated. I think at least I do in the air when the landscape is really complicated, I have a tendency to try and simplify. But sometimes when you simplify too much, the landscape actually isn't all that interesting. So then you actually need to zoom out, and then you need to find those asymmetrical symmetries. And doing that in the swamps, and then in the next image in the Bistide Badlands. Those were really great preparatory sort of composition exercises for me as we went out to the Northern Territories, Paul, which we'll get to a little bit later, because I did find that landscape quite...
Carolyn, where are the cypress swamps in a large swathe in America? They're only in a specific place. Are they? I know they're kind of in the south and east kind of area of the states. But I've actually never really figured out where the heck they even are, and yet they're quite a revered well, it's a revered landscape by a lot of photographers in America in particular, and I'd love to get there one day, but I don't even know where they are.
Yeah, it's in the south of the United States. It's actually quite a large swath, but I think a lot of where people go are Texas and Louisiana.
Yeah, I think it was sort of Mississippi, sort of area in Louisiana. And you literally, where do you get the budget? You hire them and everyone's just wandering around all over the place and there's kayaks. So what's it actually like sort of experientially? And I've even seen a guy who fashioned a 20-foot tripod so he could somehow actually set up a tripod to do long exposures out in these places because there's no other way to shoot with a tripod. Yeah, I was just curious about how that's all managed and what the reality is like of being out there.
Yeah, so you rent kayaks, and I think you've done some kayaking, right, Paul? So I was at least probably more comfortable with the whole notion because I had spent time in kayaks before. And, there are various different landing points and you kind of just get into the kayaks and you kayak out. So the more control you have over your kayak, obviously the easier it is to stabilize, but it's much like aerial photography, right? Because you're hand holding most things. You can, in the shallower parts or on the edges of places, get your tripod out. So there will be different parts in the swamps where there are places at the edges where you can get out, or sometimes there are these mini islands where you can, get onto the island, dock your boat, so to speak, and do some photography from there or wade into the water. At that point in time, there are parts that are shallower.
Is it kind of dangerous to do that because of crocodiles and things, or?
Yeah, I mean, we did see crocodiles from a distance. I never saw anything close. So I think the fear felt worse before you went, but actually the locals talked more about the water snakes that seemed to me like a little scarier in concept. So we didn't see anything, thankfully. And David had been, I went with David and, he had been there a number of times. So I felt reasonably safe that, he had been to these places a number of times and it was okay. But you could definitely in certain places see crocodiles. We'll see some of them in the images sometimes. So I did not feel
lost out there, or is it like the navigation sort of side of things? Because does it all look the same in every direction, or is it quite clear pathways, or depends on where you are? Or
yeah, I think it depends on where you are. Some of the lakes are smaller, some of the lakes are larger. But I mean, you're in a kayak, and so you can line a sight, and you can figure your way back.
And probably depends on how adventurous you are. A lot of people tend to gravitate towards quite misty sort of conditions. Is there a certain sort of time of year or time of day or atmospheric conditions that you're trying to aim for?
I mean, I think there's only a certain amount of time when it gets cool enough to be able to have that mist. So it kind of varies every year whether you get those conditions or not, but they are certainly the most atmospheric ones. Yeah, I think when I was there, there was, I think it's in the fall sometime, but I'm not sure because I've not been any other time. There could be other times of the year that are also good.
Is it only worth sort of shooting early or late, or can you actually get much done through the middle of the day, or in terms of lighting?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend on the day. Like on a more overcast day, you can do more. I think we were out there for, I think, 3 hours one morning. It was quite like we were starving by the time we got back. So you can definitely, I think it really just depends on the conditions. On an overcast day, you can be out there much longer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was just checking. One day.
Yeah, it's I mean, you'd love it for sure. So we focused a lot on the intimate landscapes and the abstracts, but I will say that, you know, while I do gravitate towards those scenes, I do pull out my wide angle lens every now and then. It isn't the way I see naturally, but some landscapes, you know, really are better suited to that. And I think it's really important to kind of have the skill set for, you know, a wide range of landscapes and conditions. And I think it's also what I mentioned before, this notion of asymmetrical symmetry. In the Bisti Badlands in New Mexico, they are an extremely complex landscape. And really, to be able to photograph well there, you have to have that kind of notion, not perfect symmetry, but asymmetrical symmetry. So I think there's a lot of good lessons when you're trying to photograph in different kinds of landscapes, and you develop the skill sets that you ultimately apply to the, like for me, aerial photography, the thing that I like to do best.
Caroline, would you consider this Badlands? And that's the word that probably people in Australia in particular are not familiar with. Like, what does it even mean? And what does it attest to the landscape? And is, you know, from my understanding, it's something that can be accessed in various forms through large areas of America. But what's the sort of underpinning geomorphology or description that a Badlands is all about?
Oh no, that's a great question, Paul. I have looked this up at one point in time, but they're kind of, well, Bisti for sure is a much more barren landscape. So there's not a lot that is there. It's a lot of eroded rock that is pretty soft. So you definitely, you know, don't want to be walking all over it. So that's kind of the most I can say right now. I will look that up on Google.
Mungo, Paul, and those kind of landscapes.
Maybe, yeah, it's certainly in the foreground. My experience also, having been sort of in and around some of them, is you'll get these things, what they're called hoodoos, which are these
yes,
and
like
I think
tall rock spires.
Yeah, they're rock spires, where they have sort of unusual shapes, and sometimes they're more bulbous on the top, and I think they're testament to just how soft the sediment rock is and how easily it's shaped by wind and so on, that you can see sort of in the distance in the center on the right, these kind of nuances to what I'm talking about with these hoodoos. It's quite a unique part of, I think, that aspect of the Four Corners sort of area of America in particular that I'm deeply in love with. But I've never really quite understood that definition because no one's ever explained it to me, and I haven't looked it up. And yet it's quite a deep part of you know, Midwest photography, particularly in America, which is where some of the greatest work comes from.
Mm-hmm. I will look that up next time. I have looked it up. I just don't have it off the top of my head.
That's so good. Me neither.
Okay. Or if you get David on, I'm sure he can definitely talk more about that. Okay, so I'm going to transition a little bit to the aerial photography now. But as you can see, I did have a number of years on the ground in landscape photography before I spent a lot of time in the air. So my very first dedicated aerial photography trip was in Iceland in 2016, but my next trip wasn't really until 2018. So at that point in time, I had 3 years into my journey. On this very first trip, which was a group trip, I really tried a bit of everything. So you can see here about a third of the images that I took were taken at a wider vantage point. A third were sort of around in that middle of the lens range, and a third were fully zoomed in. And typically on a group trip, as Paul would know, for the greatest flexibility and so that everyone is using the same lens, as we talked about previously, and the pilot doesn't need to then keep on changing their altitude for every passenger, workshop leaders will typically recommend using a 24-70 millimeter lens. And so that's why you saw I was experimenting with that full range through that body of work. So I was pretty content with my images at the time, and I still do like these images, but I feel that the trip that I took in 2019, where you'll see some of those images a little later, is definitely more reflective of who I am today, which makes a lot of sense because this was 6 years ago. And I think a lot of us who are on this journey, you know, when we look at our older work, we have points of pride in it, but we hope that we've evolved, you know, in the ensuing years.
Caroline, what drew you to Iceland in the first place? And also when you're out there, what sort of height were you consistently flying at, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, so I would say, probably the images, Tony Spencer, I love his aerial photography. Obviously, Hans Strand had spent a lot of time in Iceland at the time too. And Tony was hosting an aerial photography workshop. So it seemed like, a great fit. And we were in helicopters then, probably about 500 feet off the ground.
Oh, quite low. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, is it somewhere that this will probably be a better question for later, but at the same time, I haven't been to Iceland yet, and I'm still trying to decide whether it's been done to death or it hasn't been done by me, and not to be influenced by that, in terms of trying to reach and find any sort of innovative kind of work. I don't know what your opinion is about that.
I really felt that in 2019 when I went, that I was able to create something that was true to my photographic vision. So I think it's possible. I mean, Iceland is a stunning country, no matter what, especially from the air. So I think I would still go.
Do you think is it very specific into the turn to the windows of time of year that for aerial work in particular, or is it just kind of all around depending on whether you want a more wintry aspect or more glacial sort of one, like in terms of aerial approach?
So if you are looking for the river deltas, definitely midsummer is probably your best bet, because you really want the glacial melt to be at its peak. So really in the summer months, like middle of summer, that's when the strongest flows will be coming down from the glaciers. So that's the best time for. But if you're looking for something different, I mean, it could be different times of year as well. I'd say the other thing is with Iceland, as you may know, the weather is very temperamental. And in the summer is the time that you will most likely get consistent weather to be able to fly. But for sure, you need to leave yourself multiple days, because there may be, a few days where no planes go up. So yeah, I think the very first trip, this trip actually, it was 5 or 6 days, and it literally was touch and go. We did not get off until the last day.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
So we might not have made it.
That's my great stress when I run aerial workshops. What if we can't get in the air?
Yeah. And then when I went in 2019, it was the first day, boom. So you never know with Iceland. And in the summer, the weather is a little more consistent.
Did you make volcanic pilot?
Yes, I did. And I mean, it was so sad to hear the story this summer, because he was, larger than life. He loved his job. He was so enthusiastic, wonderful to fly with. And so it was really sad, to hear about his passing this summer. And I think the sort of international groundswell of sympathy was because he was, such a great person. So yeah, I was lucky enough to have met him.
Blessings to our brother.
Mm-hmm.
He's taken a lot of the great photographers in the world up, and certainly inspired a lot of others by who he is and how much he loves his land too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's probably not many people, non-photographic people, that have had such a big influence on photographers, I think, in the world, when I think about it.
Yeah. And, the amazing thing is he actually would photograph up there. I mean, obviously not as intently as us, but he would take photos every now and then. So the other nice thing about him is that he did understand a certain amount about photography. And one of the funny things is, he shot with a 24-70 normally, and he's like, what's this business of you photographing with an 85 millimeter lens? So he's like, he had one, so he tried it. So the fun thing was that he tried it, but he wasn't really into it. So he was back to his 24-70 the next day. But it was nice of him to try it and, to understand your vantage point as a photographer.
Yeah, well, you can imagine him, adapting, because when you get a pilot with that level of skill, caliber, and understanding about photography in particular, then I wouldn't say a lot of the work's done for you, but at the same time, it can really make a difference. What would you say in a broader sense, the influence of a pilot can have on your aerial photography? How would you sort of summate that, summarize that?
I think on average, I feel like I've been pretty lucky. I mean, obviously, I've flown with a lot of photographers that have either their favorite pilots or have done a certain amount of sussing things out. But even on our journey, Paul, I would say, you know, Ningaloo pilot, she was amazing. Like, she made it such a joy. Every photograph that we ever wanted to get, like, we could get. And then there's some newer pilots, which, you know, everybody needs to get new experience, where it's a challenge sometimes to get the photograph that you want. But I would say on average, I feel like if there's good communication, you can photograph, you know, what you intend to photograph. But there are times when you think, oh my gosh, this is the perfect, you know, partnership, right? You do everything together, it flows, it's easy. And then there are times when you're like, oh. So, but on average, you know, I would say for the most part, you can do what you want, but it does make a difference. Is that your experience too, Paul?
Pretty similar. I think the long and short of it in Australia, where I've done probably a large amount of my shooting, is we're mostly going to remote areas, and the remote areas are where all the newbie pilots end up. That don't necessarily want to be there and can't wait to leave because it's usually in the middle of buttfuck nowhere. Excuse my French. And so you've kind of got this education element, and they may or may not have any concept or relationship with photography at all, and you're just a little bit lucky if they do. So I tend to sound that out as well as I can, and there also tends to be quite a big turnaround in terms of how long they're in those locations and build up their local knowledge. So it's a bit more of a gamble, I find. Yeah, I think there's exceptions where, you know, my favorite pilot, she's now moving on, or every time I've been there, you know, there's been different younger pilots there, and you know, in a lot of the remote areas, there's a young pilot and a grumpy old person running the business that should have retired a long time ago, and they don't really get on very well. You just got to deal with it. And then sometimes the younger pilots are like super keen and super fresh and super excited to do something outside of which is just running around the same circle every day. So they absolutely froth on the fact that we're going on back into new and different places. So it's quite varied and interesting. You just need to be as aware as you can be in terms of sounding out where they're at. And I do that by getting up front of who's there and what their relationship is to photography, and sending through photos of what you're after and all that kind of thing. Anyway, I got one of those, my internet's unstable things, so my voice might be scrambly.
It's all good,
but
we'll
keep moving forward, Caroline.
The lens choice here, Carolyn, as well. In terms of, is that a focal length range that you typically use now as well?
The 24-70 or the 85? So I would say I usually go up now with two lenses, and it's the 85 millimeter and the 24-70, but I'll get to this a little bit later, but the 85 millimeter is what I shoot with about 80% of the time. Okay. And the 24-70 I reserve. So in Iceland, for instance, because there are expansive landscapes like you see here on the left, and there are the mountain ranges with Landmannalaugar, I do like to have the 24-70 because you really can't photograph that in, you know, with the 85. But in general, probably today, yeah, the majority of my photographs are taken with the 85 millimeter.
Well, you probably won't know this, Carolyn, but quite fascinatingly, and I was probably for 6-7 years, that was my main go-to lens as well. I had a fixed 35 and a fixed 85 on two different bodies at the same time, and largely for the optical quality to get out of those fixed focal length lenses, and just that challenge of, you know, isolating features and simplifying landscapes and being a bit more intimate that Caroline are both really interested in, particularly creating abstractions out of landscapes. But I bought the R5, and just on a bit of a slant, I grabbed the little kit. Well, not little kit, but it's the 24-105 L series, and it has like 8 stops of image stabilization. It's actually quite sharp, and I think as an experiment, a little fox bat, and it was only like $130 an hour or something, and I just thought I'll use this as an experiment, and I just used that body and that lens, and the productivity of my photography went through the roof. And that that there was nothing I wanted to shoot wider or longer on, and any of the shots I did, and I could squeeze every single pixel out of that camera and what it's capable of, because I was cropping in camera and shooting in camera, and often that's difficult to do out in the field with fixed focal length lenses. So I've actually found myself leaning back a little bit the other way. If I have a very specific targeted outcome that I'm really, really clear on, and complete the control of the plan on my own, then I'll probably lean back on the 85. But if I'm with another group of people, or I'm in the back seat, for instance, where I have less control over what I'm shooting and less room and avenue, sometimes I'm in a position where I can throw the camera around and get a wide shot at a certain angle, but I can only shoot from further back in the plane at even at 100. So I've actually found myself shooting a lot more with the zoom lens, and I think it was partly to do with the caliber of the R5 and its capacity to focus on the most trickiest things, all the way to its ability to focus edge to corner is like nothing I've ever seen. Normally, you've got to focus more around the middle, particularly with like abstract kind of landscapes that don't have a lot of contrast for the camera to grab onto. So quite interestingly, I've sort of moved back a little bit, Carolyn. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so but I'm curious, you had said that if you were on a solo trip where you had full control, you would still use the 85. Would you? Absolutely. Or would you keep to the 20? Okay, because that's what I had seen you posting about that, and I've converted my backup camera to mirrorless too, because the Nikon 2470 was not sharp. So this one is sharp, so it has more options. But I had actually wondered if by having the range, like what's nice about the 85 is that because it's how I like to shoot, that there's no decisions, right? Like you're just finding those particular compositions, and by having the broader choice, did that actually slow you down a little bit if you had full control? Completely understand if you're in a group, you'd want the 24-105.
Yeah, I think when I'm shooting at 85, I'm hardly looking up. I'm just completely intuitively responding to what's in front of me in that moment. Whereas when I have that choice to go wider or longer constantly, I do find myself pulling back a little bit and paying more attention to the wider landscape and the variation of shots I can get, because you might only get a certain shot from a fair way away from a final destination on a wide lens that doesn't over the top of it with an 85. So I find there's less downtime, and I found like I'm leaning in on a bigger variety of shots. And so the productivity, I think, has gone up. And also quite often it's difficult to get the exact composition you want. And when you're with a fixed focal length, you're often cropping in or cropping out of a shot to get the final composition, and you're losing those pixels. So what I lose in optical quality, which is not unnoticeable, you get a really beautiful 85mm lens that you're happy with. It just absolutely sings with the files. But when you're having to lose 30% of the file to crop in to get the composition I want, then that's the trade-off with that sharpness, and it kind of evens out quite a lot more than I would have expected.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, for sure.
It's a different mindset and approach. Lukey, what's your thoughts about that?
I was just going to say, I guess, I've done very limited aerials, nothing to the level that you guys have done, although I do generally focus more on sort of oblique landscapes and wider scenes. It's just my thing. But I've also found I'm going 24-105 pretty much the whole time. Occasionally I actually like to go wider if depending on how low we are or what have you, but I've gone up with two different cameras before with different focal lengths, and I just find having the one camera and just being able to know that well, I generally found that if I was switching between cameras, it's often at the critical moment and you actually miss it on both cameras. So that's I think I've influenced Paul a little bit on that too.
Perhaps. Yeah, he bloody has.
But it's something I always think about a lot in terms of what's the optimal way of doing it, and I feel like I've sort of gradually, after a period of time, got to doing that. So getting it right. So proof's in the pudding, of course, but definitely the way I like to go too.
Yeah, I'm a bit conscious we haven't let Carolyn sort of move through the rest of the folio. We've been staring at the same photo, so we can keep that conversation going while looking at some new work as well.
Okay. Well, after Iceland, I was lucky enough to have a work trip that would take me to Australia in 2018. I had become acquainted with Australian aerial photography via Kristen Fletcher because Tony Spencer and Kristen Fletcher knew each other well. So I couldn't let a trip to Australia go by without a photography trip. Kristen had recommended flying with Tony Hewitt, and thus I was introduced to the Australian photography scene. So I do want to take a moment just to say, I think you are incredibly lucky in Australia. There are so many wonderful aerial photographers. They're all so supportive and kind and generous. And in general, the overall community seems really organized with a lot of different events, a lot of different award programs. It's, really lovely to see from the outside looking in. So this trip opened me to entirely new aerial experiences. So previously I'd only flown in helicopters closer to 500 feet off the ground. And in Australia, due to the size of the country and the ground we wanted to cover, flying a Cessna was going to make a lot more sense. So Tony had warned me that it would take some acclimatization because not only would we be flying higher at around 1,500 feet, now you've got to bank the plane and open the window to make a photograph versus, just being able to tip your camera down from a helicopter with no obstructions, right? And also at the time, I was having problems with my 24-70 millimeter lens. So Tony kindly lent me a 50 millimeter prime, which he liked to photograph with. So this was yet another adjustment. So however, a couple of hours in, just like Tony had predicted, I started to get the hang of it. And I noticed on this trip that I took about a third of the more literal landscapes that you see here on the left, but about 2/3 of the more abstract and expressive photos. So I was already starting to shift a little bit more to that kind of photography naturally. And I was really happy with my images from this trip. And the image on the right was really one of my new favorite photos. And it was the first photo that I had that got into the Nat Geo Your Shot back when they still used to take submissions on their website. So that was fun. And then this was my third dedicated aerial trip. And this is where you and I met, Paul. So I had been really taken by the Light Collective's images from Kadithanda Lake Eyre. And I also had really been taken with Mika Boynton and Tanya Makin's images from the Kimberley. So Paul and I were able to connect and to collaborate on this trip. And it was great because as we've talked about, we had a similar kind of way that we wanted to approach things from the air. I hadn't yet shot with an 85 millimeter at that time, but I was really pretty sure that I would like it and happy to experiment. And like Paul said before, it's pretty unusual to have, two photographers that have such similar approaches, and pretty exciting that we could spend all that time together. So two things happened on that trip. One was the happy accident that in fact, only my 85 millimeter lens was working. I mean, I did the thing where I brought a new camera and I didn't have one of the settings right. So I think my 50 millimeter was fine, but it was not taking sharp images. But in the end, I really found that this body of work that we created, or that I created when we were together, was probably the most compelling and personal for me that I had ever taken. I really liked this abstract style. And the second, which I mentioned in the introduction, was that, Paul basically told me when I got there, he's like, hey, you're a competent aerial photographer. The best thing that I can teach you is how to become a fully independent aerial photographer, which was great. I'll be honest, it was super nerve-wracking at the beginning when you aren't sure if you're able to direct the pilot well enough.
I remember that well. I remember going, oh, geez, we missed that one. Oh, we missed that one. And I was like, I was just going to shut up for the back.
Oh yeah, Paul slightly backseat driving at the beginning, but it was good.
It's a little bit of a nudge. It's quite a jump though, isn't it? Like to literally just be in the front seat and have the responsibility of direction for everything. It's more than you realize, and you've got to have more things running in your head. You've got to be looking ahead rather than just what's in front of you, and thinking ahead and planning ahead and learning how to communicate with the pilot, which sometimes isn't always that easy, depending on what communications you have available on the plane. I've actually had to do it.
You're up there and you're excited, you've got the adrenaline going, you see something you like and you're just trying to work out in your mind how you want to frame it. But then on top of that, then you have to break out of that sort of intense focus and then communicate with the pilot to make sure that they can get you where you need to be. So it's almost like you're breaking a train of thought just in order to be able to communicate that, let alone recognizing the features as you see them. So I'm just interested, how much do you sort of try and train the pilot, I suppose, before you go, in terms of helping them understand what you might be looking for, and then they're sort of working a bit closer with you, I suppose? Is that a strategy that you can employ, or is it that, you know, if you can't see it as a photo, then it's hard? Yeah.
But if you're going to spend that kind of money, and it can be a lot, relatively speaking, to what you might be doing on the ground, but it's incredibly productive, so it's worthwhile. But if I literally spend quite a lot of time sounding out pilots and sending images through that are specific to that location that I'm drawn to see, get a sense of how much they know the landscape, trying to find out from other pilots or even other photographers who the kind of, you know, the go-to pilots can be, which change quite a lot because some of them move around different locations as well. Spending time even coming in the day before and just we've even gone into planes. I think, Caroline, we weren't quite sure. Let's go meet the pilot first the day before and get on the plane and get a sense of how we're going to work together and shoot, whether the lens structure we want to use works, and going through maps and the flight plan well before you turn up is a good move if you've got the opportunity to do that, because then you're not trying to figure it out on the fly or making mistakes. It is worth being quite thorough and sounding out and really being really upfront with what you're trying to capture and create. And if you're really lucky, you'll get a pilot who actually knows the landscape better than your kind of Google Earth searching and has done, and they might actually get you over features that weren't as obvious or might have evolved in color or shape or form from local conditions.
I could imagine that, like,
it can actually really accentuate work.
Yeah, you've got a scenario where, you know, Google Earth might be several years old or whatever, and they've been up there more recently, so you can rely on that sort of local knowledge and more recent viewing of the landscape, I suppose. So,
yeah.
So when I think of
my question there, that's great.
Sorry,
Caroline, is this these two images in front are a little bit. The story about these two, I think, is from the research done. Like what I got on the right is exactly what I was hoping to get, and the image on the left is something I had no idea even existed, and just happened to just wave underneath us in a millisecond moment. And that's kind of the dance of aerial photography. You can do a lot of research and get really refined in terms of the products and outcome that you want, but it really a lot of the magic comes from that intuitive in the moment responsiveness to what presents in front of you that you had no idea was even there. And particularly from really intimate landscapes, when you get down lower or closer, they're not things that are as obvious from any kind of internet-based research as in real life. And that was very much local conditions too, that there'd been a certain amount of rain and an added amount of color in terms of a certain area that was a bit unusual.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
I'm interested in your thoughts about all that, Caroline.
Sorry, what's that, Paul?
I'm interested in your thoughts about what we've just been talking about.
Oh, yeah. So everything that Paul said with the pilots, the other thing that Paul had suggested doing, we'd often show them some of our images and maybe inspiration images. I would definitely say that it would depend on the pilot, how keen they were to spend time looking at that or not. But that was, I think, the other thing I would add to everything else that Paul did. Yeah, he definitely shared his process that way and how it really helps the pilot understand what it is that you're trying to get up there. And then in terms of pre-visualization versus sort of being in the moment in the air, for sure. With Google Earth, I mean, you never know what season that image has been taken, and the light obviously impacts the shapes and forms as well. And then, there's some things that just Google Earth doesn't see. So we'll get to this in a minute, but when we were up in the Northern Territories, there was amazing like orange sand dune complex that wasn't anywhere. Like we had no idea that it was there. And we probably spent a good half an hour over that thing. It was so exciting. So there's a lot of times when you'll see things that in the air that weren't on Google Earth, and some things that look great on Google Earth that, don't look so great in person. So yeah, you have to be quite responsive in the air.
Mm-hmm. Wow, let's move on.
Okay. All right. So the image on the right is the one it's called Tidal Dancer. And this one I was, really proud of. It was one of the times I was in the pilot seat excuse me, and it's the first image that I ever had placed in the International Landscape Photographer of the Year Top 101 book. So that was a pretty exciting thing for me.
Oh, we were in there together, weren't we, that year? I think that was great. That was cool.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Roger was a wonderful pilot, I thought.
Yes, he was fabulous. He was great. So my next aerial trip was where I'd say that I really came into my photographic voice. It was really effectively there at the end of the last Australian trip, but it had been more accidental to primarily use the 85mm with its abstracted perspective then. And this time it was really intentional. And as I mentioned, it is the primary lens that I do most of my photography with. Although who knows, now with the mirrorlesses and the better lenses, you know, there are opportunities for potential change. I was a bit concerned at the beginning since I had never flown on my own. It's always nice to have another photographer there for company, or if your equipment malfunctions or just to spot things. But I was able to get comfortable pretty quickly. And at the time, I really felt like, you know, to your earlier question, Paul, that this was a bit of a different take on Iceland at the time in 2019, sort of the more abstracted view. So I'm sure that you can do something unique too when you get there, Paul. It was also around this time that I had noticed that with the multidisciplinary awards programs, so the ones that look at, you know, portraiture, architecture, also landscape, so cross disciplines, where I had received some bronzes and some silvers, that really the ones that were awarded golds or first and second places were series of images or a body of work. And I had always published my images in a body of work or a gallery, but I hadn't submitted a subsection of them in awards programs. And around that time, I had, so it was a colleague's husband's sister who is a working artist here in Toronto. And so we began to work together, and she helped me not only define my artist statement, but with statements around bodies of work and selecting some of the groupings of images. And this was the first time I had received a gold award, so that was also pretty exciting. And this work also then went on to be selected for a group show here at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, and won a second place at a local gallery's juried event. So it was pretty affirming, as you know, I was really feeling that I'd come into my own with my voice. I had a lot of confidence in my work. So it was really nice to also see that, you know, outside influences were also seeing that same thing.
Caroline, while you're on that body of work, if you just go back for a second on, and you may or may not want to speak to it, but it's, do you have, what was evolving in terms of your post-production style and technique at the same time as your shooting style and the isolation and abstraction of you know, lens choices and framing and intimacy? Was that something that came along for the ride, or where do you see that post-production aspect in your workflow?
I actually, the very first set of Iceland images that I did, I found that processing quite well. You know, I think I was just less developed in my ability to process at the time. But that was one of the first series of images, the first Iceland series that David helped me quite a bit. Because what I didn't, I'd actually come back from Iceland going, oh, I don't think I did very well, because some of those images, I don't know if it was with the older camera or not, you really have to add in a certain amount of contrast to have the images pop a little bit, because you've got all that air between, you know, your lens and the subject effectively. And depending on weather conditions, you know, you may or may not require more of that. And then, so you know, he really helped me see how to process those kinds of images. Interestingly, in 2019, I don't know if it's just my ability to photograph had improved, or, you know, better camera sensors and lenses. I found it was actually much easier to process this set of images. So I don't know if the abstraction, you know, made it easier. You know, you're more focused, maybe there's more consistency of light, you know, over the particular area. I had found that it was a little easier actually to process, but it might have just been, as you know, it had been 3 years and my skills had developed. So it was just more that things were a little more natural for me.
How would you describe your processing style, Caroline?
I still tend to, I'd say, the more natural, in the sense that I want it to be recognizable. So I don't add a ton of contrast. I don't add a lot of color. I do, so at the beginning, what I do is with the aerials, you know, first of all, you'll turn it 4 ways to figure out which way, you know, it's the most expressive to you. If you want it to be top down and you start it just slightly off, like I might, you know, how in Lightroom you can transform it so you can make it 100% top down. So I might adjust it slightly like that. And then I add in what contrast is needed. I look at the color, if there's any color casts. So if it doesn't look natural, I'll just remove the color. I don't usually add in any saturation. The color usually just comes all from the contrast. And then it's just dodging and burning and to give it the visual flow or more dimension. And then if there's like small cleanup, I will do cleanup just to make the composition like flow as well as it can. That's kind of how I approach things.
What do you mean by cleanup?
Oh, I mean, dust spots for sure. But if there's like things around the edges that are like, you know, like off and kind of distracting your eye out, like I might actually clone that out or something like that. But usually it's stuff like that.
Do you look at some of these colors are very complementary? I guess it's because they're taken in a similar location, but would you also change some tinting just slightly to make it a more cohesive sort of color range within the series, or it's just more about picking photos that actually fit that color palette?
Yeah, it's more, I haven't ever really done the changing to fit the body of work. It's really picking based on what works together. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, Caroline, that's something I also, I'll admit that I really appreciate about your work. And I've been in an unusual position that I've been sitting next to you for a lot of the photographs we're about to go through. And so I know the true to form kind of representation that a lot of your work presents, I think gives it a strength, because I don't find personally that your style leans very heavily on post-production at all. It really leans on the refinement of your compositions in the field, and you let the elegance and the simplicity of those compositions come forward really beautifully with a very natural tonality and generally quite true to form coloration. And that actually is something that stands out for me, because a lot of photographers just go pretty haywire or any direction under the sun with color and different things, whether it was even there or not. And it's something that I deeply appreciate about your work is there's still this kind of honoring of the landscape and the form that it's in and the color that it's in. And I actually personally deeply appreciate that.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I guess it's just because I do want somebody to be able to have the experience. So I don't, and I guess I just really, I feel like nature does speak for itself. You know, where I will do a little bit more is maybe just for the composition to flow a little bit better. If there's something small that I can do in that sense, like those are the things that I would do, but I feel that the color is already beautiful, you know, so I don't usually need to push it that much more.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay.
Sounds very much like your approach, Paul.
Yep. Pretty similar. She's probably a bit more elegant and refined than me, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember coming across all these. That one wasn't a surprise on the right there. Was like I went back to try and find that on my last trip and no chance. Never seen
that
anything
was the
before.
thing I was talking about. Like, we did not see that. Well, first of all, Paul and I are like, are we going to take the flyer? Okay, we'll take the flyer. We didn't really know what to expect. But it was really reasonably priced. We had the time and it looked like a really interesting place. This we did not see at all on Google Earth. So this is the thing we spent half an hour of our trip on. We just kept on going around it. And it was just so stunning, unexpected, and, you know, fabulous. So yeah, that was great.
And yet for the half an hour we spent over it, I still don't know if I found a single composition I particularly like myself.
Really?
And I probably
being too critical.
I don't think I've even posted a picture from that set at all. And yeah, and I noticed that you had it, and I was like, yeah.
It was really hard. It was really hard to photograph. It was so large and expansive, Luke, that I found initially, the instinct was to try and photograph the entirety. And then I just didn't feel like I was doing a good job. So I started abstracting it. And that's all of the images that I have of it are abstracted. But yeah, it was tricky. I 100% agree with you, Paul. It was very tricky.
It was amazing. It was one of those absolute flukes. Like that's something to consider when you're taking a flight is if you're super attached to the outcomes, then you may miss opportunities like that, because if you haven't incorporated the time to get, an extra half an hour for an unknown feature, for instance, then you miss out. Or you have to make choices in the air, like, well, we can shoot this, but then we won't get to the final destination, something you're originally aiming to do. So, and this flight was one of those flights on a larger sort of 10-day trip where it was a bit of a gamble and none of us had done it. And we were like, do we want to sort of roll the dice and spend the money and go out these places we really don't know what we're going to get? And I think that's the beauty of sharing. You feel a little bit freer to do that than when you're on your own, when all the financial costs is just on your feet, whether it's a failure or not. So that's kind of the fun part of sharing. At the same time, to be honest, I think I was struggling in the back seat there to get the composition I wanted to, Caroline. That's one of the gambles. There's not normally two good seats. There's normally one good seat and over the shoulder and get what you get type thing.
And Paul's pretty good at that.
I'm sorry, Carol.
Oh no, go ahead.
Practice.
I was just, you mentioned about not being able to find it again. I'm assuming it could be because it's very ephemeral and it wasn't there, but do you ever look at having a GPS turned on in the camera or something like that so that you can actually...
I've never had a camera with built-in GPS, and that has been a bit of an issue. There's a couple of trips where I specifically hired like a built-in GPS from Canon for that very reason. I have looked into doing that with the R5, but you have to pair it to the phone, and that pairing sort of sucks 50% of your battery life out, and that can be a real issue. So I actually haven't.
To focus on the shots, don't you? Not working out a GPS location. Yeah.
Yeah, and it chews through that connection, and that Wi-Fi blinker is just chews through massively
I guess you could record the
battery time you got as well.
The phone, and then look at the timestamp of the photo and overlay them if you're really interested in doing that. But
I think that literally that feature was gone. It just didn't exist anymore. And I actually went with the same pilot, Jean-Pierre. You remember him?
Yeah.
Wonderful guy. And it was a pretty rattly flight though, that one, wasn't it? We were bouncing around all over the place.
Yeah.
He was pretty it seemed pretty loose. It was fine. It was just like, how's it going?
Is this WA, Paul?
No, this is out of Darwin actually.
Oh, right. Yeah. Interesting. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was a great. We made some really good calls, didn't we, Caroline? We had a number where because really, like, is it worth it? Because this is going to cost thousands of dollars, and we don't know what we're going to get. Is it worth it? It's quite an intense decision to make, and Caroline and I both spent quite a lot of time sort of pondering over the pros and cons of the different places we went, and we even made some big changes. I remember we were booked to go to Wyndham, weren't we? And we literally had flights there, and right at the last minute, we changed our mind and went to Ningaloo and Exmouth instead, based on a few other things. So it's good to have a bit of fluidity and flexibility and openness as well. So you often sort of have your target groups, and then you have your let's just roll the dice sort of places. Do you want to stretch further to another island group that you've never seen any shots from, or a whole area that looks interesting from Google Earth, but I don't know anyone that's been there, or we don't know what we're going to get, or if it's the right season, and you've only got a internet photo to go from that might be years old and totally inaccurate in terms of what you're going to find. So and the beauty of having someone like Caroline and dedicated to it and a 10 days of time to go around the whole of Australia is we went places that neither of us have been before.
Yeah, and that was. Yeah, we got really lucky with that flight. That was an amazing flight.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've done it a few times since, and I still think that one we did was my favorite.
Really? Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I wonder if the tide was just lower then, which is why, because that thing doesn't look that ephemeral, right? But maybe it wasn't as deep as we thought.
You got to remember that there's some of the biggest tidal movements in the world, or this part of the world,
fair
up
enough.
there, like 11 meters, and there's huge currents that run through, and there's really rapid changes, and it's essentially mainly sand. So
yeah, okay, so we got lucky.
Lucky.
Well, This was my first series that I released during the pandemic. Obviously, it was taken just before in 2019 on our trip together. And so I want to mention it just because the pandemic actually changed my view of which images I would select and release. So that very first image, which I call Cyclone, is one that I wasn't actually thinking of including at all, because I had thought it had a bit of an unsettling quality to it. But, the pandemic made me change my mind. So, pre-pandemic, I think I was a little more focused on the natural beauty of the landscape. But, as we got into the pandemic, obviously people had lots of, feelings of anxiety. And so to me, I call it Weathering Sands. It captures kind of both the beauty and the tragedy of the world during these unsettling and isolating times. And so while there are a lot of the harmonious water and sand formations, this contrasting notion, like the turmoil and anxiety from the bright red, sometimes toxic, I don't know if these ones are, algal blooms, kind of was, a contrast. And it really felt like it was kind of more appropriate during the pandemic. So it actually became the lead image of that particular series. So it was just interesting how, the times do affect, the images that you'll release and the way the body of work ends up being put together.
Well, I got essentially the same image, Caroline, but I've never posted it, and I've really struggled personally with the aesthetic and what I felt like was a really garish kind of unsettling color palette. And I'm normally kind of moving towards a harmonious aesthetic, and that one I found really quite disharmonious. And it's interesting that you've leant into that and embraced that. Whereas with that shot, I just still struggle with it, even looking at it now. I was having a look at it the other day.
Yeah. So it's interesting we had the same reaction, but, did something different with it. But yeah, I don't think I would have released it if it had not been for what everybody was going through at the time. And then that was a body of work that I put into the Toronto Outdoor Art Fair. And just so that people can see, that was the grouping of images that I put in. And that year it happened to be all online. And you see that the toxic algal blooms in those top right images, but the rest are quite much more harmonious. And the one on the right, Paul, is the second image from that orange sand dune complex.
Yeah. I recognize the central bottom one as well from another area to the east. And it was kind of like one of those ones where there was that really interesting kind of dappled light, and somehow it really added something to it, because that's often a decision Carolyn and I are looking at, like, oh, it's going to be dappled light. Do we want that? Do we not want that for that particular landscape? And because it's a bit more of a gamble when you've got mixed cloud and you can't necessarily spin around somewhere and wait cloud goes, because it costs you $500 to do that for long enough. So you kind of have to run with that variation in lighting and just work with what's there. And that was one particular area that it worked beautifully. Yeah.
So interesting that you mentioned.
So I'll have one that I haven't released from an exact spot where it looks like a knight and a helmet. It was just you would have shot it as well. It was just I'm actually totally in love with it, but I haven't put it out there yet.
Okay, because I have one that I think looks like Nefertiti, so I wonder if it's the same.
Oh, you might. Yeah, it probably is actually.
Or similar. I'm sure it's not
because this is probably the one time Carolyn and I were like not totally on the same page. I was pretty keen to shoot a lot of the industrial aspects of this area, and when we talked about, because I was kind of coming along as an extra for this late on the late end of the second trip, and she was like, "I'm going to go out here if you want to come," type thing. So I just like, oh, why not? And it was one of those times where we struggled with getting the right lighting conditions, and we were literally just got dressed up to go to the local Kalgoorlie
was it like a horse racing or something? Yeah,
horse racing races or something. It's quite famous, and we'd given up on the idea of shooting, even though we spent like every 20 minutes looking at the weather forecast and the specific conditions we wanted. And we were just getting out of the car to go into the races, and we got a final call from the pilot, like, "I reckon there's a window." And we're like, "Oh, should we?" And we went back, and sure enough, the exact thing we were hoping wouldn't happen did happen anyway. And I'm maybe speaking for Caroline, but I remember she was a little bit bummed, I think. But I was like, well, wait a minute, but the lighting on this industrial stuff is epic. I don't think Carolyn was as interested as I was, and I think she wasn't very impressed that I was trying to push for that a bit, because it wasn't really what she was going up there for. And I don't know, what's your memories of all that, Caroline? Like,
well, funny you should say, Paul. It's definitely what I was going to talk about. So, this is the second gallery that I released during the pandemic, and it's the first one, as Paul mentioned, on altered landscapes. So Paul is definitely right. I was reticent really to photograph this area, and it wasn't that I wasn't interested. I mean, okay, Paul's definitely right. I was far more interested in the natural landscapes there, but it was a very delicate natural landscape, and the dappled light, just like Paul said, it obliterated the landscape. Like, there was nothing to photograph there. So, you know, the only other option really was the altered landscapes. And my reticence came really because I feel this personal responsibility that if I am going to photograph these areas, that I need to be really informed, because, you know, in general, my aesthetic is one that beautifies, and I didn't really feel comfortable about publishing images in these particular areas without having a point of view on, you know, was this good? Was this not good? What could we do? And so I felt a sense of personal responsibility, which is why I was a little more reticent. I definitely knew that without, you know, being able to talk to mining industry insiders, environmental activists, having the time to research it, you know, I wasn't necessarily going to be as informed as I would want to be. So that was, you know, part of my reticence. But of course, you're in there, you've got to adapt. And so we did take photographs, and I kind of, I guess, sat on these images for a while before I figured out, you know, what is it that I can say about these that will make me feel okay about publishing them. And this is a time when I think it's quite interesting when you're working with galleries and looking at their submissions, you know, the themes that they're interested in, where it kind of can help you in some ways think about the work and talk about the work. So I had seen an exhibit submission, it was called Seeking the Periphery, and it was looking on sort of shining a light on unseen perspectives. So, you know, as city dwellers, we often purchase finished products in stores. So we really don't see how the resources are extracted from the environment to manufacture goods for our consumption. And so it was an opportunity to really invite viewers to reflect on their relationship with consumption and the environment through seeing these unseen peripheries. So when I saw that, and I saw that that was the way that I could introduce them and talk about them, then, you know, I felt okay. So that was sort of where my reticence came. I think once we got into the photography, Paul, I was probably just as excited as you, but then it was about figuring out like what is a responsible way to introduce these images when I release them. So that's where I was. So your recollection is 100% correct, Paul.
Yeah, I remember thinking, oh, she's not really talking to me after that flight. She's very happy with me. I was like, shit. But that was probably the one time where quite ahead of time, I knew that I was more interested in the industrial aspect, and Carolyn was really clear she was more interested in the organic aspect, and so we went all the way out there to shoot the organic aspect, and it wasn't on. She was like, let's just go back, and I'm like, but it's right there, and so I led on her a little bit, and to her credit, she opened up and had a good crack at it, and she's won some wonderful awards, and really really I really respect the way you spend a lot of time researching and giving clarity and intentionality around the work, and giving it, I mean, that's quite a respectful way to honor a new genre of work, I think.
It really is.
So yeah, well done.
I was just reflecting on that. You know, most photographers be like, oh, that's cool. Oh, that's cool. I'll shoot that. I'll shoot that. It's really nice to have some level of responsibility or you know, what sort of meaning am I creating here? And so that's probably a next level.
I mean, I'd already done, you know, a massive series called Altered Lands, and that I'd exhibited, and you know, and I was really, really comfortable with that kind of genre, and you know, it'd been quite well considered for me. So I was in a different position from Caroline in terms of my relationship with that kind of subject matter.
Yeah,
and I recognize this feature in one of yours too, Paul. You obviously photographed it too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I thought, I did exhibit it in earlier this year in Hobart. Mine's a square rendition of the same one, and I think what I loved about it is the way it printed was exceptional, and I did it on some metallic rag paper, and it just looks unbelievable. I was just looking at it, whether I put it in a certain awards actually this week, and I thought I actually like the print way more than I like the digital file. What am I going to do? And it's a digital competition. I'm sort of like, what do I do? And it's not that often that I think Karen and I's work has sort of overlapped each other. There's a few probably exceptions here and there. I think I did a vertical version of an upside version of one of Caroline's once, or so it's kind of like that comes up a little bit, I guess, because we would have taken tens of thousands of photographs together over 20 days worth of shooting, I think, over a number of years, and there's a respect, I guess, to first or present something in a body of work. Do you then shelve it, or do you find your own voice? We're on the other sides of the planet, but at the same time, that's an aspect of shooting together that you need to navigate. I
guess you would have had that more recently too with your trip, Paul, with the two other guys.
Yeah, that'll come up quite a bit with David and Tim and I. We'll have a lot of similar subject matter that might be slightly interpreted differently, but it's there's going to be a lot of overlap. So I actually started a very early gallery of work where I said, let's just pour all our favorites into this gallery, and so that we all have time to get a sense of where our aesthetics, where the overlaps are that we have in a larger body of work, because the whole intention is to present it cohesively as a larger body of work. So the earlier we're more familiar with each other's workers and where the overlaps are, the more kind of the cream can rise to the top, and our group decisions around what we feel best represents that particular subject matter, regardless of whose it is, sort of comes to the fore. So, I had a lot of experience doing that with the Light Collective over the years as well. So a bit of a different approach, being really proactive about that, but I think it's a good one.
That's nice. Yeah.
I'm just also mindful that we're probably getting closer to time, so I'm not quite sure how long your presentation is.
Okay, keep on going.
Yeah, keep on going.
It's our fault, but
that was just the remaining body of work. And I will transition now into what's happened during the pandemic. So at the beginning of the pandemic, it was just kind of working through the backlog, like I think many photographers did. And then I was like, oh, what am I going to do next? So I had to start thinking about what I could photograph locally. And initially, I had tried wandering the streets to see if I could figure out anything compelling, but that didn't really work for me. Next, I tried going to the botanical gardens, as I'd always enjoyed that type of work, but never had that time to try it myself. And I took to it immediately. So I think that even though it wasn't a wild natural place, the fact that it was even a cultivated natural place was comforting. I could happily spend hours and hours in the gardens, and I did. And I think I also realized that any stress that I could normally have, released just by with social get-togethers and the things that you would do normally when there's not a care that you have in the world, we're starting to get released now through new creative breakthroughs in photography. And so photography in that sense was becoming a more and more important and regular part of my life. So the work in the gardens itself, I had to learn how to use a macro lens, which was a little bit difficult, to get at first, the focus at the very shallow depths of field, but I eventually got the gist of it. I noticed too, for the very first time, I started processing in black and white. I had never really had any compunction to do that before, even if I did like that kind of photography. And I think for me, because I no longer had the abstraction from aerial imagery, this was a way for me to depart from reality with this set of images. The image on the left is really the first image I took at the gardens, and it really represented this notion of time passing for me in the gardens. So here it's all captured in one image, but I spent kind of almost every weekend for 2 to 3 months going to the gardens to see the plants grow and wither. And here, this is an allium on the left. I didn't know what an allium was before this past summer, but it's kind of like the garden and garlic and onion family. There's hundreds, almost 1,000 of these kinds. And this is post bloom. So it does have flowers. They've fallen off, and this is the seed head. So the full ones have not released their seeds, and the ones that have withered have released their seeds. So we kind of see life and death in one image here, just as all of that was happening too around us in the pandemic. And then now here you'll see with the second and the third images, I started to experiment with inversions. So basically where the light parts of the image go dark and the dark parts go light. And it sort of felt like, in our topsy-turvy world, it just felt interesting to experiment with some of those techniques that were a reflection of what was going on around us. And then you'll also notice that the middle image kind of borrows from aerial photography a little bit. So it's just that I'm a foot or two above the plant versus 1,500 feet above the natural landscapes that, you know, normally I am. And I would say also there was definitely, you know, the themes of protection too in this work. So if you look at the image on the right, the spathe of the peace lily is, you know, very protective. And I was sort of felt like I was exploring the themes of growth and vitality, protection and fallibility with this body of work.
I was interested with that too, if you'd considered trying varying wavelengths of light as well, like an infrared or ultraviolet as other ways to kind of get different inverse effects or different lighting effects.
Oh, interesting. No, I hadn't, but it's a great idea that I should probably consider. The subsequent attempt that I made was really exploring solarization. Okay. So I just don't have, I think you need to change your camera, right?
Yeah,
to do the,
there's some options there, but yeah, it's something that I've always thought would be kind of interesting to play with as well.
Yeah, so good idea for the future. Thanks, Luke.
That's all right.
Okay, so after I'd finished that body of work, my fine art mentor, she had taken a bit of a hiatus and she'd come back and we were chatting. So she told me that some of my botanical gardens work kind of reminded her of Robert Mapplethorpe because he had this tendency to abstract his nudes and his floral images. And so while the image on this bottom left here is not necessarily of an abstraction, it's one of my favorites of Mapplethorpe's. You see he has a really strong sense of light and shadow. He has really interesting compositions and incredibly powerful images, probably portrayed flowers in a way that we really hadn't seen as much before. At least I hadn't. For me, they were really impactful and really got me thinking about getting into the studio with botanicals because, you know, the winter had come and there wasn't as much change that was happening in the botanical gardens. And the other things that she had mentioned, just like we had talked about before, was this notion of solarization. So Man Ray is probably the one that made it more famous, but it's also a sense of inversion, but it's more characteristic. What is most characteristic about it is that contour line that happens around the images. I think it's probably where the tones reverse. And sometimes often with the solarization, you also see this silvery glow. So I really liked that in terms of, you know, departing from reality. The other thing that she talked to me a little bit more about was, you know, still life photography. And that was becoming super popular during the pandemic because you could do it at home, you could do it in the studio. And I think my historical references to still life were more from, you know, those early Dutch movements where there were a lot more religious and moral overtones. And there was a lot of opulence and a busyness in the photography, which is not really my style. I much prefer more minimalist, abstract. And so she was showing me artists that, you know, she thought I might be interested in. So in the top left corner, we've got Giorgio Morandi, who is an Italian painter with these more minimalist kitchen still lifes here. Jan Groover, an American still life photographer, also of kitchen still lifes. And this is definitely a photographer, but you see the very painterly effect that she has with the light, which is really amazing here. And then she also showed me Ori Gerst, who is on the right here, you know, he's still practicing today. And it was quite interesting because it was botanical art, but that was also conceptual art. And he kind of makes social and political statements with his work. So this work is from the Fragile Land series. And the notion, oops, excuse me. And so what he does here is he freezes the flowers and then he does high-speed photography. So he takes an air rifle to the flower. He's got two cameras that are set up. One's on the left, it's a Polaroid, so it's an analog camera. And the one on the right is, you know, the high-res digital cameras that we all have. And so they render completely different images, one which is soft and dreamlike, that has the quality of memory, which is the one that's displayed here, and the other which is so technically precise as to exceed, you know, the resolution of human vision. And both are absolutely truthful because they are taken at the same moment, but yet they are so different, so the truth becomes questioned. And I think it's even more powerful given that photography has historically been the medium that we associate with truth and reality. So he also has a lot more layers, which I won't get into for the moment, but, you know, I was just really taken with the notion that you can also explore conceptual art through botanical photography. So I'm not quite there yet, but, you know, these were huge inspirations to me as I started thinking about doing still life photography myself. So this was the very first studio image I took, and it's good because it became so much harder afterwards, and I might have been discouraged if I had not had some early success. So I probably, you might be surprised, but took about 2,000 images to actually create my final gallery of 21 images. So it's not unlike aerial photography where there can be high volume because you can take lots of photos in the studio. But you just have a little bit more time to do it in the studio. So I had been struggling with arranging these, you know, tough dried leaves. They actually probably look quite soft with the light here, but they are, you know, tough and dried. And then I think just, you know, the inspiration from all of the images I'd seen, I was able to produce this image that really made me want to do more. So, you know, at the time that I was taking this, in those times when we were far more socially distanced and isolated, sort of the togetherness of the leaves kind of struck, I think, an emotional chord with me, which is why I called the image intimacy at the time. But where I found this work was a lot harder. In nature, you know, we can walk around or we fly and we find subjects that really compel us. We only take photographs when that happens. But here, you really need to be inspired by, you know, what's at the flower stores. And there's a lot of repetition, especially through the winter months. And over time, too, you know, taking images of plants on a background started to get quite repetitive. So that's when I started to reintroduce this notion of inversion. And I finally, you know, started the experimentation with solarization. And here is really where the process becomes quite experimental, because you kind of have to predict how things are going to change through that process. So you've got to pick the right color flower, the right color background. Then you need to know, you know, how the light is going to work, because it's different based on like the material of the flower, the translucency and opacity of the flower, how much light from the modifiers reaches the plant, which is why you end up taking 2,000 photographs to get to 21. But here you see in the top right and bottom right corners, those are plain black and whites. The inversions are the second image on the right-hand side, and the bottom middle image, those are inversions, and the rest are solarizations. And just to give you a little bit of, oh, sorry, go on.
I was interested if you also would like composite the light, so you would be able to paint in different light, or you're always trying to get it in the one image?
You know, I think I might have tried if it was easy enough to do so, but what happens with the inversion and the solarization is the pixels get quite light. So it's actually really hard to blend stuff. Like the images, the digital files get quite delicate. So it's hard. It's not that you can't do it, but it's hard to do it. So I just take lots of iterations, and that's kind of how it works. And to give you a better sense of the translation that needs to occur to get right. So on the left is the out of camera image. So you can see it's taken with studio light. You can see that the dark flower changes to white. The lighter green plant goes to a dark gray, and the dark background lightens up. So these are all the inversions that are starting to happen. And then you'd have to look quite close, but there are contours at the edges of the flowers. And that's the hallmark of the solarization. So you can see that you kind of have to guess what the final image will look like to figure out how to set up your shot. Now you start to get used to it, and you can start to predict a little bit over time. But as you start to work with a new plant, you kind of have to restart how you think, because those things like the quality of the flower, the opacity, how the light hits it, like all those things are different for every flower. And then I thought I'd just show you another way that I'm thinking of putting out this particular work. So my friend, she actually does a number of small zines and books. And so just for fun, this is not the final, but I'm just showing you interim work. I learned how to lay out sort of a book. And so for the cover image, I wanted to pick an image that because it's a soft kind of cover zine, if it was opened front to back, that the two images would look together. So you'll see that last image at the end. And then in terms of laying out for the book, and Paul, I don't know, Luke, if you've also done a book, you guys might already know all this, but these were things that I was learning.
Paul's done many.
So, you know, what she was telling me is that the eye needs to move from left to right. So the notion first that you need a pairing that makes sense, and this pairing is an opposite pairing, but that the darker image should go on the right because that your eye then moves kind of from left to right. So that was really interesting learning. And then this is sort of like an 8-fold zine. So this is the center spread. So you want an image that works well as the center spread. And again, this image moves from left to right. And then this is the next 2-page spread, again, where the darker image is on the right, but it's also a natural pairing. And this is the final image. So you want to end with a strong image, but also the very first image, I should have put them on one screen. Those 2 images actually look nice together if it's actually opened up, because one is open and the other is kind of closed. So that was kind of a fun project during the pandemic too. So learning how to do zines and kind of learning some of the basics, at least, of how to structure the work for a book.
It really looks like you would have had to learn a lot about lighting as well, if that's sort of not your general background, being a nature photographer.
Oh yeah, I mean,
artificial thing to be looking at.
I forgot to mention that. And I think in Australia, a number of you are far more diverse, so you do a lot more different kinds of photography. But for me, I had never worked in studio before, and I think lighting I would have thought was previously a little bit more intimidating. And so I don't know why it was felt more accessible. I don't know if it's just my camera skills had, you know, improved. I had been in the studio working with natural light. And then I just started watching a bunch of courses. And I think my mentor had given me a few tips. She'd actually lent me these 1980s Broncolor like lights. They are the oldest thing, totally manual. They only have 3 settings, but they're actually my favorite lights. Like, I wish that you could still buy them. But anyways, yeah, I don't know if it's just also need in the pandemic, you know, wanting to learn that. It felt far more accessible, but it was super fun. And yeah, so it's a new skill that I have.
And did you use mainly constant lights or strobes or
strobes?
Yeah, okay.
But they all have the modeling night lights now, right? So, you know, you can still, it wasn't as hard to figure out as much.
Awesome, thanks for that.
Yeah, so people that don't know, basically with the strobe light, there's nothing going on until you press the button. So your discernment around how the light's going to fall on the subject is a lot harder to realize until after you've taken the shot. And a modeling light is often a much lower powered sort of constant light that just gives you at least a little bit of a sense of where the light's going to fall in terms of the balance of shadow and light in particular. I'm embarrassingly, I bought a bunch of lights thinking I'm going to teach myself how to do it, and I haven't even opened them up.
Really? Well, because you've been able to travel now and get back to a lot
of
things.
I guess so. To me, there's still that slight intimidation factor of like, oh my God, how does this work? What do I need to? And I just haven't gone over the hump. And I think just 1 or 2 sessions will do it. But I have I don't have access to a studio, so it's a bit difficult to kind of set up and have a go, apart from in my tiny little house here. But yeah, you give me a bit of inspiration there, Caroline.
Yeah, you know what, she had a friend that rented out a studio, and he gave me a session, and I think that really helped. I mean, he was saying, and I think this would be the same for you, he's like, oh, you really understand a lot about light. So, you know, we all inherently do, but it's just learning it in the studio. So yeah, 1 session was super helpful, and it was really fun. Like, you would get it really quickly.
Yeah, I think I just need that. I need a little bit, someone to hold my hand to get over the hump, I think.
Yeah, it is nice. It is definitely nice.
Oh, that zine looks like it's going to be amazing, Caroline.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been super fun just to learn a whole bunch of different ways of presenting work and different skills. And then I guess I will finish off by giving you a sneak peek to some of the work that I have percolating. So yeah, you know, with the original set of work, I kind of focused more on individual stems, maybe a couple of multiples. And then I really just moved on to trying to do some flower arrangements. So, you know, it also really tells the story of the passage of time and evokes probably some of the more classic still life images. And so, yeah, I think it had some resonance for me because the silver sort of feels like, you know, the embodiment of our life form, which is still radiant, if not a little bit dormant, just in the darker times. So I chose like that darker presentation. But overall, yeah, I'm just at it right now, I think at a place where I think it's kind of fun to explore lots of different avenues of work, different techniques. I would see continuing some of this work because it's just something that I can do on a more regular basis. Whereas aerial photography, it's definitely, you know, more so during my vacation time. And right now, just whenever I do creative things, I find that it's really energizing right now. So, however, I am really excited to also get back into the air this summer. So I will also just be really interested to see how all of this other work kind of manifests itself when I'm up in the air and how the work changes. So yeah, it's been, you know, obviously, I think a good time for developing different skills, obviously not as good time for many other things. But yeah, that's kind of how my voice has evolved in these last couple of years. And I hope that's been helpful and insightful to your viewers.
Absolutely. And good on you too for you know, challenging yourself during those times and acknowledging that you can still learn new skills and try something different. And it's really paid dividends. So well done.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of
quite fascinating, Carolyn, to see an application of that kind of level of refinement and minimalism and abstraction and kind of intentionality behind your work applied to a completely different genre. And you know, having been a part of a lot of that process to some extent earlier on, and getting a sense of how your mind works and seeing it applied in a different way, I find really, really refreshing and quite invigorating. And yeah, maybe get off me tushy and get these lights. These lights working.
You sound like you've been plenty busy though, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much we can plant the seed. We're actually buying them, and I'm literally sitting here looking at them, and I haven't picked them up for a year. So it was a bit of a COVID purchase too, just thinking, oh, now's a good time to learn a different skill. And I ended up getting out and about a lot more than I thought I would. So if it was as intensely as other people experienced it, I think I would have gone there. Partly out of boredom and partly out of inspiration, I guess, but of both. It's one of the few genres that I haven't sort of danced in yet. Is you know, studio lighting based work.
I definitely think it was a compulsion, like a need, in fact, to create. You know what I mean? So that's I think why I was looking to it.
So Greenland and Spain next?
Greenland, well, next year, hopefully. Spain, yeah, I need to get more details, but yeah, that's definitely potentially on the roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, Eggy told me a long time ago he thought Spain was one of the best aerial destinations in the world.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, and I've had that in mind for a long time, but I haven't really delved into the research of it because it's a little bit out of reach for the last few years. So I didn't think I'd tease myself too much. But it's might see out there. Could be at the stars align and we get to go and play again. Which would be quite interesting, you know, because we've both sort of evolved in our own sort of way, and we've been quite privy to each other's sort of visual evolution as well. So I'm so glad we finally got you, Caroline. Thanks for
thanks so much.
Taking the time from the other side of the world.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Lucky, for reminding me of how beautiful it is, the place where I live. It's sort of like it's actually nice to see. Wait a minute, that's like you can probably see my house in that shot.
Road driveway, basically, isn't it? So, yeah, no, brilliant. No, and yeah, thanks again for joining us, Carolyn, and yeah, hopefully see you around the place at some point.
Yeah,
it'd be brilliant.
So definitely. I think before we go, Caroline, do you want to share your final screen with your the links to your work?
Oh yes, please. Yes.
Okay. Do you see my screen?
I would say all of you do yourselves a favor and spend some time with us. You will be absolutely delighted. Everything Carolyn posts or puts up is deeply considered and very very refined in terms of how she presents it and why. So lots to learn in that regard. Hotmail even. Wow.
What's that? Oh my gosh, yes, I know. That kind of dates me. Sorry. I do have a Gmail account too, but I'm better at checking the Hotmail.
I've still got a Hotmail, but I got banned from it for some reason, so I'm locked out of it.
Oh, really? Oh, that's a story for another time, apparently.
We'll add those links also to the video description as well. So
okay, well,
Carolyn, just quickly,
so
there's a couple. I can't actually remember the name of the one that I listened to. It might have been the Out of Chicago one. It was where you jumped on. Is there any kind of particular podcasts or things that you've done, sort of a line that you would send somebody towards as well, in terms of like a presentation or a podcast or something like that? Because I remember listening to one and it blew me away.
Probably Matt Payne's F-Stop Collaborate and Listen. That was right. The very first podcast that I did. And then the On Landscape, they did a featured photographer interview, and that is now, I believe, available to the public. So those would be two areas where I go a little bit more in depth if you would like to have a read or have a listen.
Yeah, as much as we had a couple of hours, I personally feel like we just scratched on the surface of the way Caroline thinks and works. But it's so if you want to follow that flow, then I wanted to make sure that people kind of knew that those were out there. So
they're all linked in my link tree off of Instagram, so those links are there.
Onto it. I haven't even got a link tree. That's how organized I am. Wow.
You should do that, Paul.
Probably should. I didn't even forgot about that podcast. What was it? Big something or other? I can't remember that one.
Oh, it was really great. World. The great big photography world. If you want to listen to Paul and his musings, it was a wonderful podcast. Paul is extremely eloquent, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I don't even think I even posted that one. I forgot about it.
You should.
Yeah, to start.
It was really well done.
The lecture happening again. What have I done again? Like, oh God, I can't remember.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again, Carolyn. It was just brilliant to have you with us, and appreciate your time. I'm sure you're very busy, so really appreciate that, and really looking forward to seeing your future work coming through, both with the botanical work and also future aerial work too. And those destinations do sound pretty incredible. We've had I can't remember the guest's name. It's a bit embarrassing, but
Roger Fishman.
Yes, that's the one. Yes.
Yeah.
Incredible landscapes out there. So, absolutely fantastic. So, thanks all for tuning in. Feel free to like and subscribe to the video if you got something out of it, and I'm sure you did. And we'll see you again next time. So, good night, everyone, and see you again.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks. Goodbye.